In the vast, unforgiving expanse of the Pacific, there was a speck of land known to few, its coral ringed by endless waves and scorching sun. It was a place of cruel contradictions, an atoll that seemed to taunt those who dared to consider it a foundation for war, a place where the earth itself refused to cooperate. This was the island of Guadalcanal. Its ground was soft, unstable. Anything built here would sink into its grasp, just as everything else had. U.S. reconnaissance photos painted an inhospitable picture. The land was too low-lying, too marshy, its surface jagged with coral that left no room for runways, no chance for a stable base. The Japanese had fortified it with guns trained on the sea, and there seemed no way to conquer the land beneath their feet. Yet, the American command saw only one way forward, to make this barren wasteland their stronghold in the Pacific. When captured American manuals were presented to Japanese officers, there was laughter. The idea of rapid construction was mocked, dismissed as fanciful. In the cold reality of military strategy, it was more than an understatement. Yet the higher-ups in the U.S. military remained convinced that this was the place, the key to pushing back the Japanese forces. No one could foresee the true scale of the challenge. There was no shortage of will, but the island's resistance was undeniable. Engineers, fresh off the landing boats, could feel the weight of the task they faced. Tools in hand, they marched forward, not as soldiers, but as builders. Their rifles were lighter than the machinery they carried, but they needed both for the survival of the operation. Under the sharp sting of enemy fire, every step toward the construction zone felt more impossible. The bulldozers they brought sank into the coral like stones in water, each attempt to carve out a runway only ending in more failure. The hours stretched long, and each night brought a quiet, burning question. How could you build an airfield when the earth itself seemed determined to thwart you? The first night was a grim, exhausting ordeal. Not a single foot of usable ground had been gained, and casualties, though fewer than expected, still mounted. In the darkness, with only the sounds of distant gunfire echoing across the island, a deeper realization set in. Survival was not just a matter of strategy, but of defying nature itself. This was no ordinary battle. What the engineers didn't know then was that this struggle for solid ground would soon reveal more than just a test of physical endurance. The air was thick with the acrid scent of gunpowder, the relentless hum of mortars cutting through the heavy heat. Waves crashed on the shore, but they could not drown out the staccato rhythm of death. Each explosion sent sand and debris into the air, transforming what had once been a barren construction zone into a brutal kill zone. Engineers worked in shallow ditches, their progress marked only by the rapid advance of enemy fire. The sound of explosions was punctuated by the cries of infantrymen engaged in a desperate struggle for every inch of ground. It was a race, not just against the enemy, but against the very earth beneath their feet, which seemed to shift, recoil, and swallow their efforts at every turn. In Tokyo, Japanese commanders relayed a chilling message back to their superiors. No American plane can ever take off from here. They believed it. The island, with its jagged coral and unyielding terrain, was not only a fortress, it was a natural barrier. The ground had refused to yield to the engineers, and it seemed the war would be fought on different terms, with their ambitions of air superiority slowly slipping away. Yet what the Japanese commanders could not predict was the stubborn resolve of the Marines who had landed. For them, this island was no longer just a military outpost. It was a symbol of something far greater. As the days wore on, Marine officers came to a bitter realization. Victory no longer rested solely on military strategy. It hinged on something far more precarious, a runway material that had never been tested at such scale. The engineers, once confident in their ability to conquer the land, now faced an overwhelming question. What could they use to make this impossible landing strip not just usable, but enduring? Coral, once seen as an insurmountable challenge, was now their only hope. But it was a material that had never been tested for something like this, something that had never been asked to bear the weight of war. By sunset, the engineers' camp lay half destroyed, tools scattered across the sand like broken bones from a battle with an unseen enemy. But still, they worked, silent, determined. The dim red glow of flashlights flickered over the jagged coral, the sound of shovels scraping the earth punctuating the stillness. They measured and dug, as if the earth itself might one day answer their labor. It was a paradox they could not escape. The United States had come to build, but they would have to build in hell. Every shift of sand, every movement of earth felt like a small victory, but they knew that each moment brought them closer to a question they could not yet answer. What they didn't know was that the solution to their dilemma would lie not in the materials they had brought, but in the ingenuity of a small team of engineers who would dare to reimagine everything. The order came from Admiral Nimitz, and it was delivered without fanfare, yet its weight was undeniable. Air operation must begin within days, not weeks. It was a command that set the stage for an impossible challenge. The island was not a base, it was a barren wasteland. And yet, Nimitz's words were not negotiable. The stakes were too high, the timeline too critical. The engineers on Guadalcanal had little more than the scorching sun above them and the brutal terrain beneath. They were tasked with something that felt less like a mission and more like a sentence. In mere days, they had to turn this wasteland into a fully functioning airfield, a miracle if there ever was one. From the safety of their fortified positions, Japanese scouts congratulated themselves. "Let them try," they whispered among themselves, certain that the Americans were destined for failure. The island's terrain was their fortress. The coral would swallow anything the engineers attempted. The Japanese commanders believed this so firmly that they saw no need to even defend the airfield to be. It would never come to life. Yet they couldn't have been more wrong. The Americans, despite the overwhelming odds, were already planning their next move. Their belief in success, though small, was all they had. Meanwhile, the U.S. commanders gathered their men, their voices carrying the grim urgency of the situation. They spoke not of victory, but of survival. No airfield means no reinforcements, no supply line, no survival. It was a stark truth, as blunt as the sun's relentless rays. The engineers had no illusions about the task ahead. Every shovel of coral they dug, every piece of material they carried, was part of a larger gamble. But no one could afford to lose. The island's future, and the future of the war, depended on what they could create in a matter of days. And then something arrived, unexpected, gleaming in the sun. A new material, flown in from miles away. Metal sheets, cold and unyielding, arrived like a promise that had yet to be fulfilled. The men stood and stared at the metal without truly understanding its potential. In their hands, these sheets seemed little more than another obstacle, another weight to carry through the heat. But they could not have known what those metal sheets would one day come to represent. What they didn't see was the beginning of something much larger, an innovation that would change the course of the Pacific War. From this barren island, this impossibly hostile ground, a runway would emerge, and it would be one that should never have existed. Yet the men who worked through the night, building without pause, were already on the cusp of achieving what history would soon call a miracle. The question was not if they would succeed, but how long it would take before the world realized they had done the impossible. Far from the clamor of the battlefield, back in the quiet of a warehouse, hundreds of miles away, another engineer was on the verge of solving the problem that would make it all possible. In the world of war, certainty can be both a weapon and a trap. For the Japanese command on Guadalcanal, their doctrine was rooted in a deep, unwavering belief. The American engineers were soft, reliant on machines, and incapable of overcoming nature's fiercest challenges. To them, it was a foregone conclusion that the Americans would falter. They laughed at the captured American manuals, dismissing them as naive fantasies. Garrison logs from those early days are filled with mockery. "Yankee construction fantasies," they wrote, deriding the very idea that the Americans would ever succeed in turning this unforgiving island into an airfield. The Japanese officers, walking the rough terrain, spoke of the coral beds with an air of confident finality. No bulldozer, they were certain, could ever conquer this land. The island's natural barriers, they believed, would be enough to halt any American attempt. In their minds, it was as if the earth itself had been forged in their favor. It would be a long siege, they assumed, a drawn-out conflict where the Americans, slow to adapt, would simply grind to a halt. Their assumption was more than just strategic. It was a cultural certainty, forged by years of discipline and rigid doctrine. Japanese officers had long held that their strength lay not just in firepower, but in an intimate understanding of their environment. The land, to them, was an extension of their own resolve. The rugged terrain was not merely an obstacle, it was their ally, woven into the fabric of their war effort. And so, they rationed ammunition for a drawn-out siege, fully convinced that the U.S. would be forced to abandon the effort, crushed under the weight of their own mechanical failures and the unyielding land. But they miscalculated. They had underestimated not the American strength, but the American ability to adapt. In the face of failure, where others might have seen insurmountable odds, the engineers saw opportunity. The Japanese had believed that machines could never match nature's might, that technology was a crutch. What they didn't know was that the Americans had something else: ingenuity, an unyielding drive to improvise, to adapt in ways their enemies could not predict. The U.S. engineers would not fight the terrain with brute force alone, nor would they simply hope for favorable conditions. They would bend the land to their will, working with what they had, and then, against all odds, create something that should not have been possible. In the midst of their certainty, the Japanese officers failed to see the first moral hinge of the story unfolding before them. Strength does not always lie in rigid resolve. The ability to adapt, whether in combat or construction, can be the truest form of resilience. The Americans were not merely building an airfield, they were reimagining what war could be, and in doing so, they would change the course of this battle, and eventually, the entire war. In a nearby warehouse, an engineer was about to demonstrate how American adaptability could turn even the most unyielding landscape into an advantage. With the sun scorching down on the unforgiving island, U.S. engineers began their work in a way that defied both military tradition and the laws of nature. Their tools were not what one might expect for such a monumental task. They had no drafting boards or precise instruments. Instead, they used the only things they had at hand: bayonets. With each strike, the engineers carved their plans into the unforgiving coral, sketching out the lines of a runway that would be their lifeline. The sand, gritty and sharp beneath their boots, felt more like a test than a foundation. It wasn't just the earth they were mapping, it was hope, belief, and an unspoken pact that if they could draw it, they could build it. As the engineers worked, they calculated not only the stress loads, drainage paths, and compaction rates, but also the sound of incoming artillery fire. The battlefield, just beyond the construction zone, threatened to become a constant companion, each explosion a reminder of the peril that hung over them. And yet, in the midst of it, they had a singular vision. The engineers, with nothing more than a rudimentary sketch in the sand, believed that if they could transform the coral beneath their feet into a solid foundation, the island itself would become their air base. This belief, shared among the officers and soldiers alike, was simple, almost naive, but it was their only guiding light. The island, a barren wasteland at first glance, could be made to serve. It was a daunting gamble, one that hinged on the conviction that their labor, no matter how seemingly impossible, could defy the odds. Veterans of previous campaigns, who had come to the Pacific with a variety of civilian skills, now found themselves applying their knowledge in ways they never expected. They remembered quarrying, surveying, and even railway grading, and suddenly those skills had a new application, not in the safety of a distant civilian job, but in the heart of combat. Every engineer, regardless of rank or past experience, became both a builder and a soldier. The roles that doctrine had once rigidly kept apart now blurred into a single shared identity. The engineers dug, carried, and lifted in unison, as if they were no longer just preparing for battle, but actively fighting it with each shovel and every metal sheet. The optimism that took root among them was infectious. If we can draw it, we can build it. In the face of artillery and an uncooperative landscape, that belief gave them the strength to continue, to push against the weight of the world. Yet, beneath the surface of their confidence, there was an unspoken truth. They knew the stakes. One mistake, one miscalculation, and the entire mission could collapse. The airfield they were constructing was not just a symbol of victory. It was a lifeline. The success or failure of this project could mean life or death, not just for the engineers, but for the entire landing force. There was no margin for error, and as the engineers worked under the ever-present shadow of danger, a quiet question lingered in the air. Could they truly bend nature to their will? Or would the island, in the end, remain unconquerable? Far from the battlefield, in the quiet corners of the war effort, another engineer, far from Guadalcanal, was on the verge of solving the final puzzle. In the heat of the Pacific, under the oppressive glare of the sun, the Seabees arrived with an armory of machines, D8 bulldozers, graders, and cranes. These were not the usual instruments of war, but instead tools of construction, of creation. They were unloaded amidst the crack of machine gun fire, their metal frames heavy with the weight of hope. The Japanese riflemen, hidden in their entrenched positions, watched with derision. To them, these machines were no more than a futile effort, mere metal beasts that would soon be swallowed by the unforgiving coral. As the first bulldozer revved to life and began its trek across the island's desolate surface, it promptly stalled in the soft coral, as expected. The Japanese soldiers laughed, certain that this was just the first of many failures. They believed that no amount of American ingenuity could conquer the island's terrain. Yet the engineers did not panic. They did not retreat in defeat. Instead, they recalculated. In the face of failure, the engineers responded not with frustration, but with precision. They adjusted the angle of the blade, reduced the depth of the cut, and pushed forward. Every machine, every movement, was met with careful reconsideration. These were not mere tools, not simple machines. They were battlefield assets, weapons in their own right. They became the front lines of the engineers' war, not just against the land, but against the very notion of defeat. Each bulldozer was treated with the same reverence and strategy as any weapon, its effectiveness measured not in speed or strength, but in persistence and adaptability. The coral, once a seemingly immovable barrier, was now the battleground on which the American will would be tested. The men did not work tirelessly in the heat out of optimism alone. They worked because in their hands, these machines became instruments of survival, tools not just of construction, but of defiance. Slowly, and with each laborious push, the bulldozer began to inch forward. It moved, however slowly, through the bullets, through the fire, as if defying not just the terrain, but the very perception of what was possible. The Japanese soldiers, who had been laughing moments before, grew silent. They watched in disbelief as the American bulldozer, seemingly helpless moments ago, began to push the coral aside. The earth, once unyielding, began to shift. The laughter stopped, replaced by a dawning realization. This was no longer a battle of machines versus nature. It was a battle of willpower, of ingenuity versus certainty. The bulldozer, in its steady advance, had become something far more than a tool. It had become a symbol, not of American desperation, but of American industrial strength. The shift in belief was palpable. Technology, which the Japanese had long believed to be a vulnerability, had now transformed into a weapon. What had once seemed like a weakness, something easily mocked, was becoming an unshakable force. The bulldozer had not only moved the earth, it had changed the entire nature of the conflict. What was once inconceivable was now reality. The question remained, how many more machines, each one treated with the same relentless ingenuity, could the engineers bring to bear against the island? And what would that mean for the Japanese soldiers who once thought the terrain itself was their greatest ally? What they didn't know was that the bulldozer, which had begun as a symbol of engineering ingenuity, would soon give way to a weapon far more powerful. The engineers faced a problem that was more than just technical. It was elemental. The island's coral, seemingly solid, proved to be a trap. At first, the bulldozers plowed through it with force, only to watch in disbelief as the coral shattered under pressure, crumbling into fine powder beneath the blades. It was the kind of material that could not hold weight, not the foundation they needed. The ground, once thought to be the greatest challenge, was now revealing itself as their fiercest adversary. For every inch of progress, there was a step backward, as the coral's brittle nature turned each movement into a gamble. The engineers could feel the weight of the failure pressing down on them. Each attempt was met with collapse, each failure a reminder of the island's unyielding resistance. But the men did not relent. Instead of retreating, they observed the land with the keen eyes of those who had no choice but to understand it. It was through this patient observation that they uncovered a critical pattern. Only the deeper layers of coral provided any kind of structural stability. The surface was useless, a deceptive shell that crumbled at the slightest touch. And so, the engineers shifted their strategy. They began blasting through the coral shelves, creating aggregates that could be used to form an improvised foundation. It was an extraordinary risk, a method of destruction that could have easily turned against them. Each explosion reverberated through the island, and with every blast, they knew the enemy was watching. Japanese strongpoints were just beyond the horizon, and the sound of the explosions could not be mistaken for anything other than the prelude to a counterattack. Yet there was no alternative. The island had to be bent to their will. The men worked in conditions that could only be described as unforgiving. The temperature soared above 100 degrees, and the air seemed to press down upon them like a weight. Shirtless and covered in the salt from the ocean breeze, they labored tirelessly, their bodies marked by the grit of the land and the searing sun. The sweat crystallized on their skin as they dug, blasted, and lifted, inching closer to their goal with every movement. It was work that could break a man's spirit, but it did not break theirs. For every ounce of energy spent, the possibility of success seemed to rise just a little higher. And then, after what felt like an eternity of struggle, the first graded strip began to emerge. Uneven, rough, but real. It was no longer a dream. It was proof that the impossible was possible. The engineers had done what everyone had told them could not be done. They had created a runway on an island where nothing should have been able to stand. Yet, even in this moment of achievement, there was no victory. Commanders, standing on the edge of the graded strip, cast a wary eye toward the future. The strip was a fragile thing, an accomplishment that was barely holding together. Without surface material, they warned, this runway will fail. Their words hung heavy in the air, as if the island itself was watching, waiting for the engineers to slip. But the men had already proven something fundamental. Where others saw a hopeless landscape, they saw a challenge to overcome. And the stakes were clear. There was no turning back. The question now was not if they could finish, but whether the ground beneath them would ever allow it. In the distance, far from the sun-baked island, an engineer in a laboratory was about to solve the puzzle that would ensure the runway's survival. What he did next would determine whether the men on Guadalcanal could push forward, or whether they would be consumed by the very terrain they had fought so hard to conquer. In the chaos of the Pacific, the solution to the engineers' most pressing problem came not from the ground beneath them, but from the sky above. In cargo nets, suspended like lifelines, emerged the long-awaited crates, mast and mat, pierced steel planking, an invention born out of necessity and urgency. The engineers gathered around the crates, eyes narrowing with cautious hope. The material was different, unlike anything they had worked with before. It was flexible, designed to interlock, creating a strong, load-bearing surface that could bridge the unstable coral beneath them. This wasn't just another part of their toolkit. This was something that could turn the tide, something that could finally make the impossible possible. The men wasted no time. They began laying out a small test section of the Marston mat, unsure whether it would stand the weight of the vehicles that would need to traverse it. And then, a truck rolled across the coral, its wheels spinning against the steel surface. The engineers watched, breath held, as the truck's weight settled into the planks. But the truck didn't sink. The mats held. It was a revelation, a moment that shifted the air, filling the engineers with a renewed sense of possibility. No longer were they simply fighting the land. They had found a way to tame it. The coral, once thought insurmountable, was now just another surface, one that could be conquered. The engineers, who had worked day after day against the oppressive heat and the weight of uncertainty, now saw a new path forward. But the engineers were not the only ones watching. Japanese snipers, hidden in their entrenched positions, opened fire on the mats, the familiar sound of bullets ringing through the air. They expected the steel to buckle, to crumble beneath the force of their attack. But instead, they were met with an unexpected sight, bullets sparking off the metal surface, harmlessly bouncing away. The snipers, for a brief moment, were taken aback. They had underestimated the strength of what they were up against, not knowing that the very material they mocked would soon render their efforts futile. The Marston mat was more than a piece of metal. It was a symbol of resilience, an answer to the problem that had stymied the engineers for so long. Among the U.S. officers, the realization was both immediate and profound. The Marston mat, with its interlocking design, could create airfields on any island in the Pacific. It was the key to rapid, flexible airstrips, no longer bound by the limitations of coral or barren terrain. The possibilities were vast. With it, any stretch of beach, any forgotten corner of the Pacific, could become a base of operations. The war, in many ways, had demanded this invention. Without it, victory in the Pacific would have been a distant dream, reliant on endless slow construction. But with it, the engineers saw a new future, a network of runways stretching across the ocean, connecting islands and forces in ways never before imagined. Word spread quickly among the engineers, the excitement building as each man began to understand the enormity of what they had discovered. "We are going to build a runway the world has never seen," they whispered to each other. It was no longer just about digging and blasting the land into submission. It was about creating something that could be deployed anywhere, that could rise above the challenges of any terrain. The Marston mat was not simply an invention. It was the tool that would shape the future of the war. In the confluence of innovation and desperation, this discovery became the engine that drove them forward, the force that would power the next phase of the war effort. In the days ahead, as the engineers prepared to roll out this new solution across the island, the question lingered in the air: could the Japanese forces, with their entrenched positions, ever have imagined that the very technology they mocked would become their undoing? As the engineers prepared to push forward, the next challenge was clear. Could they deploy this innovation quickly enough to change the course of the war? The engineers worked in a rhythm that was as much survival as it was construction. Around the clock, work crews rotated in shifts, 24 hours a day, their bodies moving in the oppressive heat and under constant threat. Time became an abstraction measured not in hours, but in lives and progress. The sounds of the island were always harsh, waves crashing against the shore, the distant hum of enemy planes, the staccato burst of artillery fire. But the most constant sound was the thud of bulldozers and the steady hammering of steel mats being locked into place. With each strike of the hammer, a small echo filled the air, a fleeting sound like a bell in the distance, signaling that another piece of the runway had been laid, another inch of hope had been built. The men, too tired to rest and too focused to fear, knew what they were doing was not just about survival. It was about shifting the very momentum of the war. Japanese artillery, with mechanical precision, walked its fire across the construction zone, a deadly rhythm that echoed the relentless march of time. The explosions were not random. They were calibrated, meant to shake the men's resolve, to shatter the fragile foundation they were trying to create. The dozers, those hulking machines of steel and muscle, were caught between two worlds. They were not just machines, they were lifelines. As each round landed, engineers rushed to pull their wounded comrades from the battlefield, loading them onto the very machines that had been used to carve the airstrip. The bulldozers didn't pause for rest. As soon as a wounded man was moved, the machine would return to its task, pushing forward, relentless and unyielding. It was the essence of what they were building, the capacity to keep moving, even in the face of destruction. The rain came, uninvited and fierce, turning the coral beneath them into a slippery slurry. It was a new kind of challenge, one that threatened to undo days of painstaking progress. But the engineers had learned, in the crucible of battle, that every setback was an invitation to adapt. The muddy mess that spread across the surface of the island could have been a death knell, but instead it became another obstacle to be overcome. The mats, locked together by hammer and hand, were not just pieces of steel. They were lifelines. As each mat clicked into place, it was a small victory. The runway, line by line, grew longer, its uneven surface becoming a testament to the persistence of the men who labored on it. Like a silver scar, it stretched across the island, cutting through the jungle and coral, a symbol of what was being built amid the relentless violence of the war. Struggle, once the defining characteristic of their work, began to transform into something else. Momentum. Every blast, every shift in the weather, every bullet that passed too close was met with the same resolve. What had started as an impossible task, a runway on an island where nothing should have been able to stand, was now becoming an inevitability. The engineers, who had once been uncertain of their progress, now saw with clarity what they were creating. Not just an airstrip, but the lifeblood of the American effort in the Pacific. Each man, each machine, was a cog in the machinery of war. But more than that, they were part of a moment in history. Their struggle had become the forward motion of something larger than themselves. But even as the first planes began to land on the unfinished strip, the question remained, would this fragile achievement, built with such blood and sweat, be enough to turn the tide? Could this single airstrip, forged under fire, hold long enough to become the foundation of victory? As the engineers stood together, watching the planes approach, they could not know that the real test of their work had not yet begun. But the momentum they had built, through fire, through mud, and through sweat, was already unstoppable. It was a force that would soon reach its apex. Far from the island, in a secure military facility, a new strategy was being devised that would complete the work of the engineers, reshaping the war in the Pacific forever. As night fell over Guadalcanal, a thick stillness settled on the island, broken only by the distant murmur of artillery and the soft crash of waves against the shore. But beneath the surface, something far more dangerous was stirring. The Japanese command, desperate to destroy the half-finished airstrip that had become a symbol of American ingenuity, ordered a full assault. Their plan was clear: eliminate the fledgling runway at all costs. It was more than a strategic target. It was a testament to everything they believed they could never overcome. By nightfall, the island would shake with the thunder of an assault that aimed to crush not just the airstrip, but the very spirit of the American campaign in the Pacific. The engineers, still clinging to the fragile hope they had built day by day, dropped their tools and picked up rifles. There was no longer time for construction, no longer time for hope in the face of the terrain. Now they were soldiers once again. Forming a defensive perimeter around their work, they prepared for the worst. The air was thick with tension, the hum of anticipation heavy in the dark. In the distance, they could hear the enemy, moving swiftly through the jungle, closing in on their position. The weight of the moment was suffocating, but there was no turning back. The engineers, who had spent so long trying to tame the land beneath their feet, now found themselves fighting for its very survival. Meanwhile, Marine units, poised for action, launched their countercharge. The jungle, dense and unforgiving, became a maze of choke points, where each step forward seemed a battle of its own. The fight raged on through the night, sharp, brutal, and unforgiving, both sides locked in a deadly dance through the underbrush. Yet, amid the chaos, one figure remained unmoved. The bulldozer operator, his machine a hulking force of defiance, kept working through the firefight. His blade, lowered against the earth, carved through the coral as though nothing had changed. The engine roared, cutting through the night air, indifferent to the bullets that zipped past. He was a man who had seen the odds stacked high, but who understood, deep in his bones, that this fight was not just about holding ground, it was about creating it. The searchlight swept across the island, cutting through the darkness and illuminating the steel mats of the runway. In the bright beam, the true proximity of the strip's completion became clear. It was almost done, so close that its mere existence threatened to undo everything the Japanese had hoped to achieve. The mats gleamed in the searchlights, the silver outlines sharp against the night. It was a moment of bitter irony. After all the artillery, all the blood spilled, the runway was just within reach, a few final steps away from becoming the first fully functional American airstrip on an island that had once seemed impervious to progress. By dawn, the assault had failed. The ground was littered with the cost of the fight, bodies and debris scattered across the landscape. Both sides had taken heavy losses, but the American engineers had held. The strip was still there, still standing, still growing, a fragile thing, but a testament to everything they had risked. For the engineers, the moment of truth had arrived. It was not just about holding the line anymore. It was about what would come next. Aviation fuel drums rolled toward the strip, their heavy metal containers a promise that the work had not been in vain. The planes were coming. The island, once a barren wasteland, was about to become the launch point for the next phase of the war in the Pacific. But even in that victory, uncertainty lingered. The runway was barely completed, fragile and exposed. The question remained, would it be enough to withstand what was coming next? Would the ground they had fought so hard to claim hold under the weight of war? And as the first planes began to taxi down that thin silver strip, the engineers could only wonder, what would this small victory mean in the larger story of the Pacific War? Far from Guadalcanal, in a quiet room, military strategists were preparing for the next step, unaware that the true test of the island's future was only beginning. Above Guadalcanal, the sky seemed vast and empty, but for the squadron of F-4F Wildcats circling overhead. The planes were low on fuel, low on ammunition, barely holding on to the thin thread of their mission. Beneath them, the island stretched out like an unforgiving wilderness. The engineers, weary from days of non-stop work, could only watch as the planes circled, knowing that this moment, this landing, could change everything. The Wildcats were not just aircraft. They were the physical manifestation of hope, the breath of life for the men who had spent weeks turning a barren atoll into a makeshift airfield. But as the planes descended toward the strip, they were met with a new set of doubts. Would the ground hold? Would the fragile runway, still only half-formed, survive the weight of a landing aircraft? From the ridges that overlooked the airstrip, Japanese soldiers observed, their eyes narrowing with skepticism. They had watched the construction of the runway from a distance, sure that the soft coral beneath the surface would betray the Americans' efforts. In their minds, the ground was too weak, too unstable to support anything more than a fleeting hope. It was a belief held firmly in their ranks, that no plane could land on such ground, that the very surface would collapse under the weight of an aircraft. They watched as the first Wildcat touched down, its wheels hitting the steel mats with a resounding metallic echo. For a moment there was silence, the sound of the plane's wheels on the ground, the only thing that filled the air. And then a collective breath was released as the Wildcat's engine roared on, its wings steady, its tires gripping the surface. The mats flexed beneath it, but they held. The foundation, which had been built with sweat, blood, and endless hours of labor, was solid. It was working. From the exhausted engineers below, a cheer rose, ragged but full of relief. They had not slept in days, their bodies aching from the constant strain of building, of defending, of believing in something that seemed impossible. The moment the plane landed was more than just a success. It was a triumph of human will, a proof that they had done what no one thought could be done. The strip, this fragile thing made of steel mats and sweat, was no longer just a line in the sand. It was an airfield, functional and ready. Within minutes, the Wildcats were refueled and rearmed, engines humming as they took off again, this time with the purpose of striking back at the very forces that had once believed this island was theirs. The island, which had once seemed an impassable fortress, had now transformed into a gateway of power, a forward base that would reshape the war. As the Wildcats ascended into the sky, the Japanese command, watching from their outposts, struggled to comprehend what had just occurred. The reports began to come in, planes landing, refueling, rearming, and the disbelief set in. This was not supposed to happen. The island, the land they had thought was their strongest ally, was now a staging ground for the American forces. It was not just the loss of an airstrip. It was the loss of control, a turning point in the war that could not be undone. The island, which had been so fiercely defended, had slipped from their grasp, and with it, the strategic advantage they once believed was insurmountable. For the engineers on the ground, the significance of the moment was still settling in. They had built the runway, but now it was more than just a piece of military infrastructure. It was a symbol of what could be achieved against the greatest odds. The work they had done, the hours, the risks, the countless setbacks, all of it had led to this. But even in their triumph, they knew that the war was far from over. The Japanese forces would not relent easily, and the battle for Guadalcanal would continue to rage. But for the first time since the landing, the balance had shifted. As the planes continued to roar overhead, the engineers could feel the momentum of history turning in their favor. The question was no longer if the island would become a fortress. It was how quickly that fortress would spread. In the distance beyond the newly secured strip, a new phase of the Pacific War was about to unfold. What they had built in those fleeting days under fire had just become the foundation for a much larger campaign. And the question now was, how long before the enemy realized that the true cost of this victory was still to come? In a distant office, military planners already began shifting their strategies, unaware that the turning point had already been marked in steel and sweat. By the time evening descended upon Guadalcanal, the island had already transformed before their eyes. The once barren, unyielding land now bore the weight of something that could not be undone: air power. The first sorties launched from the newly constructed airstrip, roaring into the sky and immediately attacking nearby Japanese positions. The sound of their engines echoed like a distant promise fulfilled, reverberating through the jungle that had only days before seemed insurmountable. The planes, though few in number, were a testament to what had been achieved. An island that had once been dismissed as impossible to hold was now a staging ground for American dominance in the Pacific. And yet, it wasn't just the fighters that filled the sky. Bombers followed, their heavy payloads doubling the island's striking power in a matter of hours. The change was so rapid, so profound, that it was almost surreal. What had been an empty patch of coral was now a fully functioning airbase, an island transformed overnight. U.S. logistics teams, working tirelessly under the weight of their own fatigue, began to expand the single strip that had been laid so carefully by the engineers. The construction moved with a sense of urgency and purpose, each worker knowing that this small stretch of land had become the centerpiece of a larger strategy. Taxiways were quickly added, service areas were carved out of the dense jungle, and the airfield began to take shape as a fully operational hub. It was no longer just a single strip for landing planes. It was a complex, a vital artery for the American offensive. Each addition, each patch of earth carved into form, brought the island closer to something that had seemed impossible: a network of air power, woven through the very heart of the Pacific, ready to strike at the enemy's core. For the Japanese, the shift was nothing short of catastrophic. They had believed that the island, with its soft coral and treacherous terrain, would never become a threat. They had watched the Americans build their runway with a quiet sense of disbelief, certain that it would never hold, that it would never become more than a fleeting attempt. But now, from a field they had long dismissed as a dream, American air raids were coming, fast and relentless. The sound of the bombers taking off, the screech of their engines, shattered the illusion of invulnerability the Japanese had held so tightly. Morale, once high on Guadalcanal, began to collapse. The reality was undeniable. The island was no longer in their control. It had become a launching pad for the very force that had once seemed distant and untouchable. The US had not only built an air base, they had turned the island into a symbol of defiance, a testament to the fact that no place was truly out of reach. American officers marveled at what they had achieved, standing amidst the hum of engines and the thrum of machinery, watching as their plans unfolded before them. It was a feat of engineering and logistics, jungle to airbase in a matter of days. The transformation was not just physical, but symbolic. What had been an empty stretch of coral had now become the cornerstone of an offensive that would change the course of the war in the Pacific. For the engineers who had labored day and night, their work was a testament to something far larger than themselves. It was a reflection of their will, their determination, their refusal to accept defeat in the face of seemingly insurmountable odds. But even as they stood back to admire the fruits of their labor, the engineers knew that the fight was far from over. They had built something extraordinary, but the real weight of their accomplishment could only be measured by what came next. As they paused long enough to feel the full weight of what they had built, the island's fate, and the fate of the campaign, seemed sealed. Steel, sweat, and will had transformed this island into a fortress. The question that lingered, however, was whether it would stand the test of time, or whether the forces that now sought to reclaim it would find a way to undo it all. The first chapter of the battle had been written, but the story was far from finished. In the coming days, the engineers would discover that the island's transformation had set in motion a larger series of events, but they could not have known that what they had built would soon be tested in ways they could not yet imagine. The real question was no longer whether the airstrip would hold, but whether the war itself would bend to the will of those who had defied nature. Across the Pacific, the maps of war were being redrawn in real time, though it was hardly visible to those who did not see the work being done beneath the surface. The airfields, once unimaginable on so many islands, were springing up in rapid succession. They became the lifeblood of the American offensive, a network of launch points stretching across vast distances. These strips of land, formed of steel mats and sweat, began to change the very nature of warfare in the Pacific. With each new airfield that was constructed, U.S. forces gained something more than just a landing spot for planes. They gained range, speed, and the ability to project power across entire island chains that had previously been unreachable. What had once seemed like an insurmountable ocean of territory now felt more like a patchwork of islands waiting to be connected, as long as the planes could take off, refuel, and strike. For the Japanese planners, the shift was disorienting. They had always believed that the rugged, unforgiving terrain of the Pacific would be their greatest advantage. It was a strategy rooted in certainty. No matter how hard the Americans tried, they could not conquer the terrain. The jungle, the coral, the isolation of these islands, they were their greatest defenders, obstacles so massive that they could hardly be overcome. But with the American engineers' success, that myth began to dissolve. No island, no matter how inhospitable, was beyond the reach of American engineering. The reality of what had been accomplished began to sink in, not just on the ground, but in the strategic rooms of Japanese command. The land they had relied on for protection was no longer an asset. It was a liability. Each new airstrip was a crack in their defense, a reminder that the laws of geography no longer applied. As U.S. engineers rotated to new islands, carrying with them the hard-earned lessons of fire and coral, they were not simply continuing a job, they were redefining the very nature of warfare. The tools they had once used to carve out airstrips, bulldozers, graders, steel mats, had become symbols. They were not just machines or construction materials, they were emblems of a new kind of warfare, one that bent nature to the will of man. The engineers, now seasoned by their work on Guadalcanal, knew the stakes were much higher. What they carried with them were not just blueprints, but an understanding that no island could remain beyond the reach of the U.S. war effort. They had learned to adapt, to persist, to reshape the land beneath their feet, and now they would do it again. Each new island a continuation of the story of defiance against nature itself. With each new construction project, the strategy itself began to bend and twist to the new reality that had been created by the engineers' work. The once predictable rhythms of military strategy, built around the constraints of the terrain, now had to account for something else: the relentless advance of American air power. The ability to build airfields wherever they were needed, to establish hubs of operation on islands that had once been dismissed, changed the calculus of war. No longer were the Japanese safe in their belief that their islands were impregnable. Now every island they held was vulnerable. Every ridge and every forest could become a site for American planes to take off and strike. As the engineers continued their work, pushing forward into new territories, the question they faced was no longer if the Pacific would be reshaped by their efforts, but how quickly the tide would turn. What had begun as a small, improbable victory had become a larger shift, the beginning of a new phase in the war. The Japanese forces, once so confident, now had to contend with the reality that their hold on the Pacific was slipping faster than they had ever imagined. In a faraway laboratory, new tools were being designed, new methods being tested, but what they didn't know was that the weapons they mocked, those very tools that had seemed so fragile, would soon erase their advantage entirely. In the chaos of battle, the engineers did not wait for the dust to settle before they began their work. Reports from the front lines tell a story of men who repaired runways during the heat of combat, not after the fighting had ended. The roar of distant artillery and the crackle of machine gun fire did not deter them. It only sharpened their focus. While others sought cover, the engineers continued to push forward, moving their bulldozers and shovels with steady precision. They understood, perhaps more than any other, that their work was not a mere afterthought. It was part of the fight itself. If a runway was not ready, if a strip of land was not cleared, then the war would stall. Planes would not land. Men would not be resupplied. They were not just builders. They were warriors, fighting with every shovel, every turn of the bulldozer's blade. Medal citations tell of bravery not with rifles in hand, but with the tools of construction. Shovels became as much a weapon as any firearm. Bulldozers as essential as the fighter planes they were meant to service. The engineers did not shy from danger. They stood in its face, fully aware of the stakes. They were not soldiers in the traditional sense, but their bravery was no less. Their task was clear: build, repair, and maintain the very infrastructure that kept the war moving forward. The danger was constant, but so was their commitment. As survivors of those harrowing times later recounted, the fear they felt was as palpable as their need to build. "Build it right, or men die," one engineer recalled, his words weighted with the memory of the lives that depended on his work. In those moments, the responsibility was not just to finish, but to finish with an unrelenting precision that could mean the difference between life and death. The Japanese soldiers, in their diaries and reports, later recovered, expressed astonishment at the speed of construction. What had seemed like an impossible task, transforming barren, hostile islands into functional airstrips, was happening before their eyes, and they could not understand how it was possible. The engineers, with their bulldozers, steel mats, and ingenuity, were rewriting the rules of warfare. Each new runway that was built, each new airfield that was completed, seemed to appear overnight, giving American forces the mobility and striking power that had previously been unimaginable. The enemy could not fathom how these men worked with such speed, with such relentless drive. They believed it was an advantage to control the land, but the engineers had turned that advantage into a liability. The land that was once thought to be an insurmountable obstacle had become their most reliable ally. But as the airstrip spread across the Pacific, the human cost became impossible to ignore. Many of the engineers who laid those strips, who built the very foundation of the American air war, never saw a plane land. They died on the islands, their sacrifice woven into the very fabric of the American advance. They were often the unsung heroes, their names lost to history, yet their contribution was no less monumental. It was they who shortened the war, mission by mission, island by island. Their work made possible the victories that followed, the ability to resupply, to reinforce, and to strike. Each new airfield that appeared on the maps was a testament to their work, a legacy that would forever change the course of history. As the war drew to a close, reflection deepened. In the brutal calculus of warfare, where destruction often seems to dominate, the engineers understood something profound. Creation, building something from nothing, could be as decisive as any act of destruction. While bombs fell and cities burned, the engineers were laying down runways that allowed for the delivery of supplies, the arrival of reinforcements, and the execution of missions that would lead to victory. In their own quiet way, they had helped to shape the outcome of the war. In the silence of their hard labor, the engines of war had turned, and with it, the fate of nations had been sealed. The question now is whether the world has truly recognized the weight of their work. Their tools, shovels, bulldozers, steel mats, had become symbols of a new kind of warfare, one where creation was as integral to victory as destruction. And yet, even as the war ended, the legacy of the engineers' work, their craft, their sacrifice, remained. What they had built was not just infrastructure, it was the foundation of victory, a quiet testament to the power of human will in the face of unimaginable adversity. In a quiet corner of the world, far from the front lines, another engineer was about to face the next challenge, one that would redefine the future of warfare. The Pacific Campaign, fought across hundreds of islands and atolls, became a story not just of military might, but of ingenuity, of airfields built where none should exist. In a landscape defined by jagged coral, thick jungle, and hostile terrain, the American engineers had turned impossibility into something tangible. What began as barren, unforgiving land was transformed into functional airstrips, each one a testament to the power of adaptation. The war, which had been fought on the ground and in the sky, was now shaped by the unseen hands of those who had learned to bend nature itself. The campaign was no longer just about battles won or lost. It was about the silent victory of engineers, whose work had rewritten the laws of warfare, shifting the balance of power across the Pacific. For the Japanese, this transformation came as a brutal shock. Their confidence, rooted in the belief that the terrain itself would keep them safe, became their blind spot. The very coral and jungles they once believed to be impassable were now being turned into strategic assets by the Americans. What they had thought of as a natural fortress, impervious to invasion, was being transformed into a network of launch pads for American planes. Steel mats, once seen as a crude solution, became the very spine of an empire's undoing. The Japanese garrisons, confident in their strategic strongholds, now found themselves facing a new kind of war, one where the terrain was no longer their ally. Each new runway that appeared was a reminder that the Americans had found a way to take the impossible and make it real. For the engineers who worked tirelessly, day and night, the stakes were clear. Their labor would decide the outcome of the war. Many of them never saw a plane land on the strips they built, but those who survived would remember their work as something more than construction. It was survival itself. Veterans would later reflect on their efforts, their sacrifices, and the grueling toil it took to create these airfields. "We built them one life at a time," they would say. It was a grim acknowledgement of the cost of their work. For every inch of runway that was laid, a piece of their soul was given in return. But that labor was not in vain. It was the lifeblood of the Pacific Campaign, the very foundation on which the future of the war was built. The island airfields, now scattered across the Pacific, remain etched in the historical record as monuments to impossible labor. They were not just strips of land or military assets. They were symbols of human perseverance, of what could be achieved when necessity demanded it. Even decades later, the story of the engineers who built them serves as a reminder of the power of invention and determination. Their names, often lost to history, are woven into the very fabric of the war effort. They proved that in the end, adaptability, the ability to reshape the world around you, was the ultimate weapon. And as the war came to a close, there was a final echo of history that resonated across the Pacific. They mocked the engineers once. They never mocked them again. The very same engineers who had been underestimated, who had been dismissed as dreamers, had proven to be the architects of victory. In the end, it was their work that had turned the tide of war, not just on the battlefield, but in the skies above. What was once impossible had become a reality, and with it, the course of history had been forever changed. But the story of these engineers was not just one of military strategy. It was about the quiet revolution of human capability, an enduring legacy that would resonate long after the war's end. As the world moved forward, the lessons they had learned on the island airfields would continue to shape the future of warfare. And the question lingered, what other seemingly impossible tasks could be overcome by those who refused to accept the limits of the world around them? In a warehouse, hundreds of miles away, engineers were already developing the next solution, unaware that the very principles they had used in the Pacific would soon apply to the next stage of the global conflict.